Good evening, everyone. My name is Jay Rosenzweig, and I will be your moderator for this important session, examining the concept of proportionality in war in the context of the current conflict in the Middle East. By way of introduction, I am the founder and CEO of Rosenzweig and Company and board chair of Erwin Kotler's Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights. The Raoul Wallenberg Center is a nonpartisan organization that advocates for human rights across the globe. I have a background in law. I manage a company that operates internationally, and I'm a passionate advocate for advancing human potential globally. The brutal attacks carried out by the Hamas terrorists on October 7, 2023, and Israel's subsequent military actions in response have brought the issue of proportionality in modern warfare to the forefront of international debate. Proportionality is an aspect of what is known as just war theory. It involves weighing proportionality of conditions that justify certain acts during a war, so long as these acts are not excessive. Of course, judgments of proportionality can be indeterminate due to the complex nature of war. However, this should not discourage us from applying the proportionality theory as best we can. So this panel discussion, involving distinguished experts on the topic, will explore the application and challenges of proportionality in various conflict zones with the aim of fostering dialogue amongst policymakers, scholars, legal experts, politicians, military experts, and really society at large. So let me now introduce our panelists. And in terms of format, I would say each will be allocated 5 minutes to provide his or her perspective on the topic. This will be followed by a series of questions from me, and time allowing, questions from the audience. Let me begin with Alan Dershowitz, Emeritus Felix Franker Professor at Harvard Law School, who is not only a distinguished legal scholar, but also a best-selling author and an individual who's been described as America's most peripatetic civil liberties lawyer. Professor Dershowitz has been the recipient of many accolades and awards, including a Guggenheim Fellowship for his work on human rights and a fellowship at the Center for the Advanced Study of Behavioral Sciences. His best-selling books have been translated into many languages and have sold over 1 million copies worldwide. So welcome, Professor Dershowitz.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
What are your thoughts on the concept of proportionality as it relates to the current conflict in the Middle East? We'll give you like 5 minutes.
My first thought is that nobody understands it. Most people, if you ask them what proportionality means, they would say that if Hamas killed 1,500 or 1,200 Israelis and captured 250 people, a proportionate response would be to make sure that Israel only kills 1,500 and kills maybe a few others. It has nothing to do with that. Under the laws of proportionality, if an army kills one Israeli soldier, the Israelis are entitled to kill 10,000 soldiers. Proportionality has nothing to do with tit for tat. It has only to do with 2 points. One, the principle of distinction between civilians and combatants. And second, if you're marshaling a military attack on a mixed target, a target that contains both combatants and non-combatants, those conducting the military operation must conclude that the value of the military target is proportional to the expected and anticipated civilian casualties. So that if you're going after one soldier, an ordinary soldier who's in a hospital, and in order to get that one soldier, you have to endanger the lives of 20 or 30 civilians, that's not proportional. On the other hand, if you're going after a major leader, or for example, the nuclear facilities of Iran, then the number of civilians that you anticipate will die or be injured can be very high, in proportion to the value of the target. So the first thing that the people authorizing the rules of engagement, authorizing the attack must do is decide on the value, the military value of the target. That's going to be very subjective. It's obviously a rule of reason. And then you have to anticipate what the likely civilian casualties are. At the same time, you try to reduce the amount of collateral damage, but you don't reduce it to the extent of endangering your own soldiers or the military goal. So to summarize, the point is, first, you must distinguish between combatants and non-combatants. And if you have, and you can kill as many combatants as you have to. There's no rule of proportionality when it comes to combatants. And by the way, just to get to something very current, a combatant is somebody who is involved in the terrorist or military operations. And of course, Hezbollah decided who the combatants were when they gave them communication devices. So everybody receiving a communication device, even the ambassador from Iran to Lebanon, was automatically a combatant. And so Israel was entitled to blow off the heads of every single one of the people who are holding these kinds of communication, military communication mechanisms. Now, they had to know, of course, that in the process there would be some lying around, and maybe a child would be killed, maybe an innocent person would be killed, and they would have to ask themselves the question, how valuable is the target compared to the possibility? Now, in usual rules, and I'm sure we'll hear more about this later, when Great Britain, when NATO, when the United States have fought in Afghanistan and Iraq and other places, the general proportionality has been in the area of about 4-to-1. That is, approximately 4 civilians have been killed for every combatant. In Gaza, the proportion is much, much better. It's between 1.5 and 2-to-1 in terms of civilians, and that's by Hamas's numbers. If there were 40,000 killed and 17,000 were combatants, the ratio there is about 2-to-1, the best ratio ever achieved by any military in the history of warfare. The ratio achieved in the Beeper attacks is, of course, much, much lower than that. It's probably 1 civilian for every 100 combatants, and yet today the Pope had the chutzpah to announce that he was appalled at Israel's response in Lebanon without a single mention of the fact that the reason for that is that Hezbollah sent thousands of rockets starting on October 8th. It was as if, according to the Pope, the Israelis suddenly one day, without any provocation, decided simply to bomb Lebanon. That's been true of academics. That's been true of CNN. It's been true of many in the United Nations. And tragically today, it was true of a very good and great man, the Pope. So if I want to give the Pope one assignment, it's listen to the recording of this or read a book on proportionality before you speak and condemn only one side of what is a historically tragic conflict. That is the fault only of those who started it. Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon.
Thank you, Professor Dershowitz. Our next panelist is Colonel Richard Kemp. Yeah. Colonel Kemp served as a British infantry commander and spent much of his career combating terrorism and insurgency in Iraq, Iran, the Balkans, and in Northern Ireland, where he was wounded in a terrorist attack. He headed the international terrorism team at the Joint Intelligence Committee in the UK Prime Minister's office and was chairman of the multi-agency intelligence group at COBRA, the UK National Crisis Management Committee. Colonel Kemp is an expert on Hamas and Hezbollah, and he has been present in Israel since the war began in October 2023. He spent much time at the Gaza border, and he has made numerous visits to the Lebanese border and Judea and Samaria. So, Colonel Kemp, please briefly share your perspective on this current conflict.
Yeah, I think I'm afraid to say that in the war that started in October last year, we've seen many, many examples of disproportionality, too many that I can possibly mention now. And it's really a tragedy. And the disproportionality is the disproportionate attacks against Israel around the world. That is what is disproportionate here. And much of it emanates from this building and from associated UN buildings. If you look at, and it's not new, this has been going on for many years. In the last decade alone, the United Nations General Assembly, which has been meeting here today and this week, has made resolutions condemning Israel for war crimes and other similar crimes 155 times in that period. All other countries combined, all other conflicts combined, have been condemned only 88 times. That is almost the definition of disproportionality. And of course, the UN Secretary General, who presides over this place, is probably as guilty or more guilty than most other people. We just heard yesterday, I think it was, some comments made by the UN Secretary General effectively accusing Israel of collective punishment in the war in Gaza. Far from it. But he said it, and the UN Secretary General saying something like that means a hell of a lot and feeds the propaganda machine that's directed against Israel. The fact that civilians die in war is a great tragedy, but it happens in every war. And it does not mean that the country that's imposing those casualties is carrying out collective punishment. He went on to imply in his speech that we were about to see the same kind of problem in Lebanon. And basically, he's been making accusations about Lebanon that suggest that this is Israel's fault. What has the UN Secretary General been doing since 2006, when UN Security Council Resolution 1701 put in place a system to prevent Hezbollah from being anywhere near southern Israel? You know, that UN Security Council resolution has 12,000 peacekeepers in Lebanon backing it up. And what has it achieved? Nothing. Nothing. And therefore he, the UN Secretary General himself, is culpable. If you look at, go beyond that, look at the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice. The International Court of Justice obscenely accuses Israel of genocide. It is an obscenity. Yet the reality is that it's Hamas, which is a genocidal organization. They don't have the power to commit genocide. They've stated that's their intention. They've done their best to do it. That is the genocidal organization. The International Criminal Court has distorted its own mandate, its own founding charter, the Rome Statute. It's distorted it in so many different ways to get the Prime Minister of Israel and the Secretary of State for Defense in Israel into the dock in The Hague, accused of war crimes. It doesn't matter what Israel does, and there's no proof of this, and there's not going to be any proof of it, because it is not true. And it doesn't matter what Israel does. Whatever it does, it's committing war crimes. I want to give you two very brief examples of that. The first one, you will have heard of the World Central Kitchen attack in April of this year, in which tragically a number of aid workers were killed by an Israeli drone strike, purely by accident, by bad procedures, but not intentionally. President Biden said this is unacceptable, totally unacceptable. He had forgotten that in August 2021, under his presidency, there was a United States drone strike against what was considered to be an Islamic State terrorist cell in Kabul as the US and NATO allies withdrew. That drone strike killed 10 people, including 5 children. They weren't Islamic State terrorists. Most of them were aid workers. And the situation came about in a very similar way to the World Central Kitchen by misidentification by the US of a vehicle. So that wasn't unacceptable, and nobody was prosecuted for that. And in my view, quite rightly, it was a tragic mistake in war. The second example I want to give you, Professor Dershowitz mentioned the Pope had the chutzpah to accuse Israel. Well, another person who had the chutzpah was Leon Panetta, the former Secretary of State and CIA director, who said that those pager and radio explosive-laden devices was terrorism. Leon Panetta, very prominent figure in the United States. He'd forgotten that when he was the director of the CIA and the Secretary of State for Defense after that under President Obama, he presided over a massive drone strike campaign in Pakistan, which killed many terrorists, quite rightly, but also, unfortunately, killed many civilians. This is why we have the double standard we face. And the reality is, no matter what Professor Dershowitz or any of the other people on this panel tell you about proportionality or any other aspects of the laws of war, they do not apply to Israel. There are separate rules for Israel. Everything Israel does, it's wrong to do it. Everything other countries do, they can be excused, they can be understood on the basis of the reality of war. So that's the situation we face today. Thank you.
Thank you, Colonel Kemp. Yes, yes. Our next panelist is Colonel John Spencer, Chair of Urban War Studies at the Modern War Institute at West Point. Spencer is also coordinator and co-director of the Urban Warfare Project and host of the Urban Warfare Project podcast. In addition, he is also founding member of the International Working Group on Subterranean Warfare. He served over 25 years in the U.S. Army as an infantry soldier, holding ranks from private to sergeant first class and second lieutenant major to major. His assignments as an active duty Army officer included 2 combat deployments to Iraq. Colonel Spencer's research focuses on military operations in dense urban areas, megacities, urban and subterranean warfare. Colonel Spencer, given your expertise in the areas of urban and subterranean warfare, please briefly share your perspective on proportionality.
So in order to understand that question, I think we have to do the legal definition that Professor Dershowitz and other people will discuss. You have to also put it into context of the actual military mission. What is the context of the war, the battle, whatever, and then add a historical perspective. And I think I'll talk to you about the historical perspective. Because there is no number that determines whether Israel has been proportionate, discriminate, tried to prevent civilian casualties like they have. That's not the way the law of war works. It isn't the effects. It is what did you know? What is the assessment you made? What did you do to prevent harm? Then the operation. Then you assess whether somebody's being legal. I like to provide people the historical context because of that's kind of been used as a justification. I can tell you historically as a student of urban combat that nobody's ever asked a military in the history of war, but what's your civilian to combatant ratio? It's never been asked. It wasn't asked in 1945 when the US military re-entered the Philippines and went to Manila to retrieve our prisoners of war, 3,000 prisoners of war and men, women, and children that have been left behind called internees. General MacArthur that organized a battle, hit the beach, said, go to Manila, retrieve our people. Very similar to small portions of Gaza, there was a very radical defender of urban terrain. There were 17,000 Japanese defenders in that city, holding those hostages and the civilian population that they didn't care about. We attacked with 37,000 American military and some Philippines and fought a very tough battle. And one of the reasons is because General MacArthur didn't want the city destroyed. So he said, no air power, no bombs. We don't want to destroy the city. 100,000 civilians were killed in that battle. And most of the city burned to the ground. And nobody asked, what's your civilian to combatant ratio? And the part where I do in this business of historical data is that even in today, there's 3 types of lies. There's lies, damn lies, the statistics. So I can give you a bunch of numbers. I can, like Professor Dershowitz, give you Hamas's numbers, compare that against what Israel says. Since if we're going to take the word of a terrorist, we should take the word of a democratic nation with values as well. That it doesn't add up. But everybody kept trying to compare this to the most destructive, more destructive than Dresden. They're just lies, damn lies of statistics because they're aggregating or disaggregating data. In more modern, somebody will say, well, John Spencer, that's before the Forced Geneva Conventions. We don't do that anymore. Do what? Protect civilians? Because of that 100,000 civilians, the Japanese killed most of those. They were slaughtering civilians. They didn't care about civilian life. They actually starved the civilians so there would be a humanitarian crisis when the Americans got there. Sounds real familiar, right? There's been two battles since then because there is difference in war when the enemy is given time to prepare the city for defending. And I think one of my colleagues will talk about kind of the military context of the tunnels, the weaponization of the law of war, the use of the hospitals, the schools, and using human shields. But there's only been two major battles that I can find where I can give you a comparison because militaries that follow the law of war like Israel does, or the United States, or the UK and other Western militaries are really far and few between. We don't want to talk about the Syrian war with 300,000, 18 to 23 people dying a day for 10 years. We don't want to talk about that. We don't want to talk about Russia and Chechnya where they killed 10% of the population just over a couple major cities. We won't talk about that. Or Russia and Ukraine, carpet bombing Mariupol, and unknown number of civilian deaths. So I only give you American examples or British coalition examples. So the Second Battle of Fallujah is the biggest battle of the entire Iraq war. Because everybody likes to say, well, that's not what we did during Iraq and Afghanistan. It's the second biggest, it is the biggest battle of the entire Iraq war. And why? There's only 3,000 enemy because they were given 6 months to defend it. And most of the city was destroyed to take it back from 3,000. But the one example that people keep trying to use, and I found because they don't even know what the law of war is. They don't know what war looks like. Is the 2016 to 17 Battle of Mosul, where ISIS had taken a city, and there were 3,000 to 5,000 enemy combatants in that city, and 1 million civilians were trapped in the city and actually told to stay initially. Which we can talk about. Why has this been so hard for Israel? And nobody mentions the fact that Egypt didn't let a single Palestinian out of Gaza Strip, so they own many of the actual death of civilians. But in this battle, in the Battle of Mosul, the biggest battle since World War II. So it was bigger than the battle that I was a part of the campaign to overthrow the Iraq government. It's bigger than the Battle of Baghdad of 6 million people. And why was the biggest battle? Because the enemy had 2 years to get ready for a battle. So they prepared the defense of the battle. It took 9 months, 100,000 Iraqi security forces to get just 3,000 ISIS defenders out of that city. 10,000 civilians were killed. But we actually don't know how many civilians were killed. It was a year later before. This is also the part that I find fascinating in, okay, we want to assess proportionality. We're going to use the numbers that the terrorists give us within minutes. So I've never seen a combatant with that level of computer technology to know how many civilians died in a strike within hours. If I tell you in most urban wars or battles, it's been years later. It's crazy. But in that battle, what they also don't talk about is that the Iraqi military lost 10,000 soldiers to take that city, one city. There's 6 cities like Mosul in Gaza. But ultimately, where it comes down to is when you talk about proportionality, you also have to talk about, of course, you do the proportionality assessment, and then the last part says anything reasonable and feasible to prevent civilian harm. This is where I can say with historical data and being in Gaza, that Israel has implemented more measures. It's a whole field of study that I work in as well called civilian harm mitigation. Like, despite what the enemy is doing, you still got to protect civilians. And Israel has done more of that, has implemented more measures to protect civilians in the history of war. It has evacuated cities. It has done daily pauses. It has not taken strikes when it could have, legally. It has done encirclements and not fired a single round and asked the civilians to come through them and use facial recognition. They've done more than any military in the history of war has ever done, and somehow they say you're not proportionate. It's pretty wild, but the facts don't lead to that conclusion. Even if we took the enemy's numbers, which are impossible, there are not 41,000 Palestinians that have been killed in Gaza. That's a fact. I can say that with strong conviction that there has not been 41,000 Palestinians that have died in Gaza. There have been 41,000 deaths or reported deaths or double names or missing personnel or people that died of natural causes, according to Hamas.
Thank you, Colonel. Our next, yes. Our next panelist is Major Andrew Fox, military strategist and analyst. Major Fox is a research fellow at the Henry Jackson Institute, a nonpartisan transatlantic foreign policy and national security think tank based in London. Major Fox's expertise include the Middle East, defense, and the psychology of disinformation. Mr. Fox spent 16 years in the British Army, completing 3 tours in Afghanistan, as well as serving in Bosnia, Northern Ireland, and the Middle East. Welcome, Major Fox. Briefly, what are your thoughts on the concept of proportionality of Israel Hamas, Israel Hezbollah? What's your take?
So I've taken the liberty of scripting my opening remarks, and I've timed them to exactly 5 minutes. So hopefully I will stick to that.
You come prepared. That's great.
Read through. First of all, I would like to acknowledge the victims of war. We can't reasonably discuss proportionality in combat without first understanding that war is not an abstract concept. The state of Israel currently faces a war on several fronts. And any compassionate observer must note that innocents are suffering. Israeli citizens, some massacred or taken hostage on 7th of October by Hamas. Tens of thousands of them have been displaced by Hezbollah. Some innocent Gazan civilians have been caught between Hamas and the Israel Defense Forces, forced to shelter in tents in the Mediterranean summer. There are innocents in Lebanon who've been forced to flee their homes in order to evade missile strikes, as Israel target the Hezbollah fighters who've used their homes as weapons storage sites. So Prussian theorist Karl von Clausewitz, he wrote that self-imposed restrictions termed international law accompany war without essentially impairing its power. If we take his definition of war, which is an act of violence to compel our opponents to fulfill our will. These acts of violence in war, in an era where war is amongst the people, will inevitably lead to the suffering of innocents. This whole discussion hinges upon whether those acts of violence are legal and proportionate. Saint Augustine articulated the theory of a just war. He wrote that governments need not be ashamed of protecting peace and punishing wickedness. He wrote that the sacred seat of virtue is the heart. Israel's jus ad bellum, as St. Augustine termed it, or their reason for going to war against both Hamas and Hezbollah, is absolutely clear. I and a number of my fellow panel members have walked in human ashes in Kibbutz Be'eri. I've been to the site of Nahal Oz, where Hamas burned alive 22 Israeli soldiers. I've visited the site of the Nova Festival at Re'im, where Hamas murdered innocent partygoers. And also, I've seen the evidence of the sexual assault of Hamas on the 7th of October. Israel is a country created by a resolution from this very organization in which we sit. No country on earth could accept a threat of another 7th of October on its borders. Nor could any country in the UN accept over 9,000 rockets fired indiscriminately at civilians, displacing some 60,000 of their citizens. Israel's jus ad bellum is beyond question. But what about the other half of St. Augustine's equation? He wrote about jus in bello, or conduct during war. And if we return to Clausewitz, he wrote, the coarseness of war's elements excites repugnance. And I can tell you from first-hand experience that war is repugnant. However, we cannot assess a war based on those feelings of repugnance. Never in history has a war been fought that has not included visceral and bloody death. Extreme violence, the suffering of civilians. It is not, however, the death that is to be used as the vehicle for our assessment of any conflict. Under international law, what matters is the manner and the legal justification for that death. I've spent significant weeks with the IDF. I've been to Israel 3 times since 7th of October. I've examined their targeting processes, their rules of engagement, and their design for the wars they're currently fighting. I'm entirely satisfied that their processes and procedures match, or in some cases exceed, those of Western armies in terms of satisfying their international legal obligations. That said, it's inevitable that when young men and women are trained to be violent and are placed in the most horrific of settings, as war is, some will break those laws. It happened at Abu Ghraib in Iraq, Camp Breadbasket, Fallujah, Yusufia, all of them in Iraq. And it happened with the Australian Special Air Service Regiment in Afghanistan and possibly the British SAS as well, and that's an investigation currently ongoing. What matters, though, is how those breaches of the law are dealt with. Since last October, the IDF has launched 74 criminal investigations into the conduct of IDF soldiers. This is a tiny, tiny percentage of the 300,000 IDF soldiers who've served in Gaza. I've also examined the IDF's legal mechanisms, and I'm convinced, absolutely convinced, that they are correctly holding their soldiers to account. And this is what moral armies do. War is repugnant. Proportionality can only be assessed through an objective lens. Is the war just? And is conduct during the war just? And even while innocents suffer, as they always do in every war, I'm convinced that Israel meets both those criteria. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Major Fox. Our next panelist is Barrister Natasha Hausdorff, Director, UK Lawyers for Israel. Ms. Hausdorff is an expert commentator on international law, including the law of armed conflict, foreign affairs, and national security policy. She holds law degrees from Oxford and Tel Aviv universities and was a fellow in the National Security Law Program at Columbia Law School in New York. Ms. Hausdorff previously worked for the prestigious American law firm Skadden Arps in London and Brussels. She also clerked for the president of the Israeli Supreme Court, Chief Justice Miriam Naor, in Jerusalem, and she serves as legal director of the UK Lawyers for Israel Charitable Trust. Welcome, Barrister Hausdorff. What do the laws of armed conflict tell us about this current situation?
Well, thank you very much. I think when we're looking at the concept of proportionality in the laws of armed conflict, one would be hard-pressed to find an aspect of international law that has been more resoundingly misrepresented in the history of international law. And everything my fellow panelists have already said should give you a strong flavor of how that has potentially come about. I think it's extremely appropriate that we are here having this discussion in this building, because here is unfortunately, one of the epicenters, combined with the international media and diplomatic discourse, of the misrepresentations on proportionality. As Professor Dershowitz has outlined, it is not a case of comparing casualty figures. That would be macabre. It also, unfortunately, serves to encourage Hamas in seeking to drive up the civilian casualty count as much as possible, and as Colonel Spencer has referred to, inflating it in many respects. And there are a number of studies that have determined that and revealed it. But there is something, I think, much deeper at work here in terms of the misrepresentations of the laws of armed conflict. And I recall very early, already in October, John Kirby, the National Security Council spokesman, himself a military man, indicating that according to his perspective, the only number of acceptable civilian casualties in this conflict, in Israel's war in Gaza against Hamas, was 0. Now that is preposterous. There is no armed conflict in which any law-abiding military can ensure 0 civilian casualties. And when one takes into account the challenges that Israel has been facing on the ground in Gaza, faced with a terror infrastructure that has been embedded in civilian homes and in every mosque, school, and hospital over 16 years of Hamas control of the Gaza Strip, it is something that I, together with Colonel Richard Kemp and Major Andrew Fox, had the opportunity to view for ourselves on the ground in Gaza only a couple of weeks ago, both in Rafah and along the Philadelphia corridor, where we viewed the tunnels between the border of Egypt and Gaza that had supplied Hamas and that had enabled it to build that infrastructure. So that is the context in which Israel is fighting this war. And of course, it's the context in which the rules of international law are being so badly misrepresented. I consider that to be a problem not just for Israel, but for every law-abiding state, because it is shifting the goalposts into the unachievable. John Kirby's 0 civilian casualties. The reality is that the measures that Israel takes to prevent the casualty count for civilians, to prevent civilian deaths in armed conflict, are unparalleled in the history of warfare. They not only comply with the key principles of the law of armed conflict, necessity, distinction, proportionality, and precaution, but the measures that the IDF takes far surpass them. And there are many military legal experts, including those sitting on this panel, that will tell you that the US and the UK, the British Army, and other law-abiding armies would struggle to meet the incredibly high standard that Israel sets. I believe that comes not just out of the Military Advocate General Corps' role within the IDF, which is also unparalleled, the military lawyers that go through target lists and conduct that proportionality analysis on a strike-by-strike basis that are embedded within every unit and that sit outside of the military chain of command. They are answerable to the Attorney General in Israel so that they can tell more senior officers yes or no with respect to individual strikes based on their proportionality analysis. So it's not just because of the unprecedented role that lawyers have in the Israeli Defense Forces. I believe it speaks to something far deeper. And it speaks to the moral code, the code of ethics that the IDF instills in every single soldier in the first week of basic training. It's also reflective of the fact that the IDF is a citizen army. It is an army of conscripts. Those individuals who enlisted after the atrocities of the 7th of October, there was over 140% enlistment. Those individuals, doctors, lawyers, engineers, school teachers, plumbers, carpenters, that put on their uniform and reported for duty and did so because they knew they were defending their families. These are individuals that have grown up in the only democracy in the Middle East and have had instilled in them those democratic values, prizing freedom and life above all. I see that as integral to the precautions that the IDF takes and the case-by-case analysis, because it's individual soldiers that are having to make those decisions on the ground in real time and have to live with the decisions that they make in those contexts. Now, that's not in any way to do down professional armies around the world, but I think it's important to bring that into the context and bear that in mind in the realm of the war that Israel has had imposed on it. It's vitally important to understand that proportionality in armed conflict is not an effects-based analysis. It is intention-based, and that is based on, of course, the intelligence that goes into designing, targeting lists, and conducting a proportionality analysis. But ladies and gentlemen, that means that there is not one talking head, one military commentator, or one legal analyst that can tell you that any particular action that Israel has taken is disproportionate. They simply do not have the information to base that decision on. Those states that have been provided with that information, that Israel has shared sensitive intelligence with, the UK and the US included, have consistently said that they are satisfied that Israel's targeting and proportionality approach complies with international humanitarian law. And other experts, as you have also just heard, have indicated that in many respects it far exceeds what is required. And that is important to recognize. So, where is the disconnect between the reality, which we have all imparted to you, and what we hear out of this building and many others? Lawfare, ladies and gentlemen, an abuse of law and legal processes and international legal institutions. And while that abuse is perhaps most on display and most effective with respect to Israel, what starts with Israel will not end with Israel. Every law-abiding state, every individual that prizes the rule of law, ought to be very concerned about this phenomenon. Because politicizing international law and international legal institutions in order to advance a political agenda against the Jewish state discredits international law, discredits the International Criminal Court, discredits the International Court of Justice, and it weakens those institutions should we ever seek to use them against the real abusers of international law and human rights, the real war criminals. That is why this panel is so significant. That is why every representative here at the United Nations ought to be in this room, listening to the real experts, those with experience on the ground, and those with decades of experience in the legal arena. And I'm very grateful for the invitation.
Thank you, Barrister Hausdorff. Fantastic. I would now like to ask panel members some specific questions, and the other panelists are welcome to jump in. I'll begin with Professor Dershowitz. We've been talking about this institution and the World Court, etc. And I know that you've been critical of the World Court, taking up South Africa's attempt to label Israel's actions as a genocide. But this brings up a broader issue to me, and that is who, if anyone, should act as an impartial arbiter in conflicts like these, and can we realistically expect any external body to regulate these things? And if not, is self-regulation the only option that we have? And one other thing I'd layer on top of this is that Israel, of course, has been defending its adherence to proportionality, but is not necessarily doing that well in the court of public opinion. So I wonder what your take is on this dynamic.
Well, great question. And let me give you one piece of evidence about the politicization of the International Criminal Court. The law is the law, and the facts are the facts. But in Great Britain, the position of the government changed based on an election. The left came to power, the right was eliminated from power, and suddenly the law changed. And suddenly Great Britain said, oh, whoops, we were wrong when we said there's no justification for going after Prime Minister and the Minister of Defense. We were wrong. We've now had an election, and the election tells us that we now think there were war crimes. Could there be any better evidence than a great law-abiding country like Great Britain changing its position on the law based on a politics? Tragically, there is no alternative. Look, I worked with my friend Luis Ocampo. We're very close friends. We taught together at Harvard. He was the first prosecutor at the International Criminal Court, and we really had some hope. I actually asked the United States to join the court, and the United States was actually, Israel was actually thinking of joining the court, but when the United States refused to, Israel didn't. And I worked with Ocampo on the Rome Statute. And the Rome Statute, of course, has the most important aspect that any international court can have, complementarity. And that is, it's a secondary court. It's a court that says, look, we will trust the judiciary and the legal system of every country, like Israel, like the United States, to do their own evaluation. We will only step in as a secondary court if they are unable or incapable or unwilling to
Right.
exercise a jurisdiction. And of course, there's the Israel exception. No country is better able. You know, there's a joke they tell in Israel. When Israel ordered a new F-25 and they went to the United States and they said, we need 3 cockpits. And they, 3? Yeah. One for the pilot, one for the navigator, and one for the lawyer. And, you know, Israel, I actually sat in on an event in Israel where they were targeting a terrorist that was called off because there were children
Right.
in the area. So there is no country in the world which satisfies complementarity better than Israel, and yet, and I spoke to the heads of the International Criminal Court. I've argued cases there, and some of the people on the court were very upset with the head of the court, who just yesterday met at the UN with some of the most evil people and didn't meet with Israeli people. They are determined, they're doing it in the interest of public relations. They're doing it for 2 reasons. One, core anti-Semitism, anti-Israel, but the other one was, hey, we're going after these African countries. Let's go after some white, you know, Western democracy as well. Well, why not Israel? We're not going to get any pushback on that. So I think the International Criminal Court has failed, tragically, because it's a real court. The International Court of Justice is not a real court. It's not international. Israel doesn't traditionally serve on it. It's not a court because its justices are picked by the countries and in some instances must represent the country, and it wouldn't know justice if it fell over it.
Yeah.
So International Court of Justice was a failure from the beginning. The International Criminal Court could have been a success, and it was largely a success under Ocampo, but under the current chief prosecutor, it's an abysmal failure,
Yeah.
and I think really marks the end of any international legitimacy to judging other countries. Can I make one other point?
Sure.
I just want to correct everybody who talked about the invasion by Hamas of Israel on the 7th of October. No, it was an invasion by citizens of Gaza, led by Hamas. But many of the people who participated in the murders and the rapes were ordinary Gazans. And I think Israel made a tactical mistake. Instead of declaring war on Hamas, it should have declared war on Gaza. Now, people would say, oh, that would recognize that, but Gaza was given over to originally the Palestinian Authority, and then a coup was taken over. But Israel is at war, not with all the people of Gaza any more than the United States was at war with all the people of Germany. But they weren't at war. The United States didn't declare war on the Nazi Party. It declared war on Germany, and Israel should have declared war and should threaten to declare war on Lebanon, because we know too many Lebanese civilians are allowing their homes to be used as combatants to facilitate. So, you know, international law has proved to be worse than the absence of any law when it comes to Israel and the conflict in the Middle East, tragically.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. My next question is for Colonel Kemp. To ensure proportionality, and we've talked about this, but I want to lean into it a little bit more. Israel has taken enormous risks with its own soldiers and fighters to protect civilians and civilian populations in Gaza. Was this required of Israel, given the battleground that that Hamas set, given the setting, given the methods chosen by Hamas?
I think if you're going to fight in a war and you're going to try and adhere to the laws of armed conflict, then there is always going to be an additional risk to your own soldiers. And that's been true of the United States and the UK and other countries who have been fighting in places like Afghanistan and Iraq. And you know, their soldiers, in order to protect the civilian population or to not harm the civilian population, numerous American and British soldiers have died. And in the same way in Gaza, very large, or not very large number, but a certain number of Israeli soldiers will have died out of the need to adhere to the laws of armed conflict. I think one quite important point is that when Israel plans to carry out a strike, an airstrike or a strike on the ground, whether it's using infantry, artillery, or tanks or any other of its weapons. It normally, not in every single case, but normally will issue warnings to the target areas. And that's done through a number of different means, including in this war, by millions of text messages, voice messages, phone calls made directly in Arabic to individual people living in Gaza, sometimes by leaflet drops. And as an example, I'm not sure it's happened inside Gaza, but certainly we've seen recently similar warnings given in Lebanon by the Israelis hacking into Lebanese radio and television to transmit warnings to people. These sort of measures are taken routinely by the Israelis, which is, we've heard it here several times before. These kind of measures, they're not routine measures taken by other armies. This goes well above and beyond. But one thing it does is it alerts the enemy that you're coming. And that in itself is dangerous. It's dangerous if it's a ground offensive, in particular to the troops concerned. It's also dangerous in terms of the overall war objectives because it risks enemy targets which need to be taken out getting away, which obviously increases the danger from the enemy. So there's numerous different forms of danger that adhering to the laws of armed conflict take. One thing I would say about that is that the laws of armed conflict don't actually require you in every case to give warnings. It says, I think in the relevant convention, it says when practicable or when possible, you should give warnings. But the IDF almost invariably give these warnings before they carry out an attack. And not only do they give warnings, they also then maintain surveillance on an area they're planning to attack that's got civilians living in it through drones, other aircraft, other means, to see when the population in the relevant area has left. And that all takes time, and it gives time for Hamas to, for their terrorists to move, for them to move critical weaponry, etc. It's not something that most military commanders would do, but generally speaking, the IDF does. Just to clarify slightly, one difference is if there's a very high priority target. For example, let's say the IDF identified the presence of Yahya Sinwar somewhere in Gaza. They're not going to, unless they're totally insane, they're not going to give a warning that they're going to attack that area. He's such an important target. And the proportionality calculation made in his case, Sinwar's case, would probably lead the commander and the lawyers making that decision to conclude that you could maybe have a higher number of potential civilian deaths than you would in the case of a lesser target. And that's partly what proportionality is all about. He is such a critical figure that you might say it's proportionate to kill X number of civilians when, in the case of a less significant target, we'd only have risked killing Y.
Great, makes sense. Colonel Spencer, I want to lean in a little bit more into your context that you provided in terms of other Western countries within the military. The United States has wrestled with these issues over a long span of history. Some have termed aspects of the Indian wars in the 19th century as genocide. At the close of World War II, there were those who questioned the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The presumption behind just war theory is that there is a right way and a wrong way to fight wars. And this has governed Geneva Convention thinking since the 19th century. But war is in some ways fairly simple. One party attacks another party. The other party fights back. One of the parties wins. One of the parties loses. Perhaps there's a draw from time to time. And this has been the way of the world forever. Are things different in 2024? Hamas attacked with monstrous ferocity and vows to do it over and over again. And Israel counterstrikes. In today's world, especially in light of media coverage, etc., have new lines been drawn? Just wondering your perspective on all of that.
Yeah, I've written a little bit about this, especially within the legal framework. Is I believe Israel has created a new standard that I don't think should be followed. In every aspect. So this is, war is fought in the context in which it happens in, the political context, the variables. One of my first writings was stop comparing Gaza to anything, any other war. There's been no other situation where a defender has prepared the ground for 15 years for war. I used to say before visiting that Hamas, put tunnels under all the hospitals, the schools, the UNRWA facilities. And after being there, I learned I was wrong. No, they built the tunnel and then put the school on top of it. They put the mosque on top of it. They prepared an area for defense for 15 years. I can't find that unless I go into ancient warfare. They've dug 400 miles of tunnels. They're the only combatants I can find that use human sacrifice as their strategy. We say human shields, which is lots of terrorists did it. Al-Qaeda does it. ISIS does it. Everybody. But Hamas says and acts in every way to get as many people killed as possible to achieve their political objectives. That's human sacrifice. I don't want the standards in which Israel is being held to, I call it the Israeli standard, to be continued because I believe that would lead to greater war and suffering. There is a different way that Israel could have done this. And there's a different way that the U.S. military or any other Western military would have done this. They would have responded to this invasion of their nation on their border with thousands of rockets emanating out of enemy territory towards its civilians, hundreds of civilians, babies, elderly, women, taken into tunnels. They would have responded immediately with overwhelming force, to include raining down to ensure not one rocket came out of enemy territory. That's not conjecture, that's fact. I can give you all the numbers of how many forces would we attack when an urban defender has 15-1 advantage over you. We wouldn't match. Israel attacked with 4 divisions against 40,000, just Hamas. And as Professor Dershowitz says, inside of Gaza, there are lots of other people who turned themselves into combatants by attacking the IDF, crossing into Israel, doing vile things. Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Lion's Den, regular civilians. I don't want this standard being viewed in any way, even the evacuation of cities before attack. This is the hard part in just war theory that you have to acknowledge, is that through the pursuit of putting limits on the brutality of war, which is a good thing, but through the pursuit of what we think is possible. This is all, again, irrelevant to history. Everybody had lots of advice of Israel how to bring their hostages home. Just negotiate. Well, this is not a rational actor. Hamas held a single hostage for 5 years and wouldn't give them up for unless you exchange for 1,000 vile criminals. That was irrational. Use special forces. Use strategic bombing. It was all a fallacy. Never, ever tried. It's crazy that we believe, and I am problematic, even in evacuating cities, invasion of Iraq, Afghanistan, Panama. You win in war by using overwhelming speed, surprise, and force to make your enemy lose the will to fight. So the world owns some of the legitimate suffering that has happened at the hands of Hamas in Gaza because they said, well, don't do it that way. Do it a different. Don't go into Rafah, where the hostages are, where the tunnels are. Don't go here. Don't go there. Yeah, it's okay that Egypt won't let anybody out and get them all the way out of safety. I don't want that standard continued in the future because it will lead to greater human suffering.
Very interesting
Could
way of putting it.
I just expand
please jump
briefly
in.
on something that John said there? He quite rightly described what Hamas's tactic, and indeed to an extent its strategy, is as human sacrifice rather than human shield. And the effect the reason they're doing it, they're not just doing it because they don't care about their civilian population. They don't really care about them one way or the other. But what they do care about is as many deaths in Gaza as they can achieve, civilian deaths. Why? Because that brings international pressure, condemnation, isolation, vilification onto Israel. And what does that achieve? The theory is that stops Israel from attacking them. The only way they're going to survive is if Israel stops attacking them. Hamas tend to do one of 3 things when Israel attacks. One is to die, the second is to run away, and the third is to surrender. And only if Israel stops fighting like that can they possibly survive. And so that's the whole basis of their strategy, their tactics they're using. And it's places like this, in the UN, in the UN Human Rights Council, in other places, that perpetuate that. When they decide that Israel's guilty of war crimes, when the ICC chief prosecutor tries to have arrest warrants issued for the prime minister and the defense minister of Israel, they are basically playing into Hamas's hands. They're showing Hamas, your tactics work. Keep doing it. These people in this place, in the UN Human Rights Council, in the ICC, in the ICJ, they really do have blood on their hands.
Thank you. Major Fox, one of the many concerns as it relates to civilian casualties in Gaza and Lebanon is that while you wipe out today's terrorists, you might be radicalizing the next generation. You've served in places like Bosnia and Afghanistan, and I'm sure you've witnessed firsthand how individuals can be radicalized in these kinds of environments. Realistically, can Israel expect to completely eliminate Hamas and Hezbollah?
I don't think Israel is trying to eliminate Hamas and Hezbollah. Okay, when you go to war, it starts with a political objective. And again, to go back to Clausewitz, as I mentioned in my opening speech, war is the extension of politics with the mixture of other means. You can't go to war without a political decision to do so. And when you do so, you need a political aim. That when your soldiers are on the ground pulling their triggers, there should be a direct line between what they're doing and the goals of the politicians who sent them to war in the first place. So when we talk about radicalizing Hamas or radicalizing people to join Hamas, actually we're not trying to eliminate an enemy in its entirety. We're not trying to destroy 100% of Hamas. In my conversations with strategic planners at the IDF in the Kiryat in Tel Aviv, the word they use is dismantle. And that's really important. Okay? You cannot wipe out 100% of Hamas. But what you can do is you can take apart their strategic capability to hurt Israel and their administrative capability in Gaza. I'll deal with the first one here, because to dismantle their strategic capability, what are their strategic capabilities? First of all, it's the rockets. It's the manufacture of rockets to attack Israel. It's the firing of rockets at Israel using the tunnels and using people's houses and people's homes to give them that protection that they think international humanitarian law gives them, because places like the UN are happy to suspend international law in order to condemn Israel. So we deal with the rockets. The next strategic weapon is the tunnels. Okay, I think people saw this for a long time as a kind of hidey hole, as a kind of way of negating the IDF strengths. The IDF have total overmatch for Hamas in the air and on the ground. And so Hamas have gone underground to try and get away from the IDF strengths and create a strength of their own. And at the start of this war, you could walk underground from Gaza City in the north all the way to Rafah without ever seeing daylight. A Hamas commander could go to work in the morning, to his office underground, to the shops on the way home, and never see daylight. The IDF have found vitamins for my American friends. Vitamin D is stored in huge caches underground because they know they won't see daylight for huge periods of time. And so by destroying the tunnels, that's vitally attacking Hamas's strategic capability.
So after World War II, General Eisenhower is quoted in a newspaper saying it'll take 50 years to denazify the Nazis. And if you ever think I'll give Germany the power to wage war again, you're crazy. Those are direct quotes. I think Professor Dershowitz is right that, again, if you want to remove this power from both political and military power, there is a military strategy, achievable, definable to do that. But it will take a long time to keep Hamas from power. And Israel, I think, has the will to do that. But it's absolutely achievable.
You know, I think it's an empirical question. It's become a mantra of America and of the world that if you kill Hamas terrorists, you will only create more terrorists. That's either true or false or true to a degree. I believe empirically it's false. Germany and Japan are perfect examples of where we beat the hell out of them. We killed them. Hiroshima, Nagasaki, who became our best allies shortly after? The Japanese people, the German people. Look what's happening in Gaza. Polls are showing that the Gazan people are turning against Hamas, and polls are beginning to show that in Lebanon they're turning against Hezbollah. So I think there needs to be research done, empirical research done, to put the lie to this mantra that if you kill terrorists, it only creates more terrorists. If you kill enough terrorists, you will make it impossible for more terrorists to come forward, particularly those who value life, who really value life. So I would like to see, as a research project, I don't know who can conduct it, to see whether or not there is historical and empirical basis for what I believe is a totally false claim that's made by virtually every world leader today, including every leader in the United States.
There is a major difference with the context that we're facing vis-a-vis the Palestinian Authority and Hamas, and to do with radicalization, and that is essentially the complicity of the international community in the two real causes of this radicalization: indoctrination to terror and incentivization to terror through the pay-for-slay policy. 3/4 of the terrorists who crossed the border on the 7th of October were educated in UNRWA-run schools, according to the curriculum designated, designed by the Palestinian Autonomy, the Palestinian Authority, the so-called moderates in the West Bank, where they teach children from kindergarten up that the highest calling in life is to pursue martyrdom and kill as many Jews as possible. And under the pay-for-slay policy, again, under the Palestinian Authority, the so-called moderates, they pay the salaries of terrorists no matter what banner they coalesce under. Ali Kadi, one of the chiefs of the Nukhba force, who orchestrated, planned for some 2 years the 7th of October attacks, who was released in the Gilad Shalit deal, was paid a monthly stipend, which by all accounts enabled him to plan those attacks. These are stipends that are essentially funded by the international community, the international taxpayer, and they support the children who have grown up through the indoctrination process under UN-run schools. Those terrorists that crossed the border on the 7th of October had also, many of them, because of their age, had never seen a Jew, because the Jews had been ethnically cleansed from Gaza in 2005. So it's absolutely right that this canard of radicalizing additional individuals has no place here, but it is a useful smokescreen for the true reason that Israel is facing a genocidal force, proxies of Iran. Now, that hasn't come up yet this evening, but it's absolutely right that it's not just Hamas that crossed the border on the 7th of October, and it is not just Hezbollah that is posing a further existential threat to Israel, but these are all Iranian proxies. And in the broader context of the war by Iran on Israel, everything that we have seen in terms of the misrepresentations of the facts and the law are playing into the terrorists' hands.
Thank you. I think we should have done a 3-hour session. I've got so many other questions, but I wanted to go to the audience to see if we can get a couple of questions from the audience, and then I may wrap it up with another open-ended question to conclude. Yes, go ahead.
First of all, thank you so much. My question is, we're not surprised by the insane criticism against Israel by the echo chamber of Islamism in this building. But what excuse do we have for Britain and America? Are they cozying up to the Islamists on their own soil? Is this part and parcel of the new Sharia compliant trajectory? I'm trying to understand what's happened to the normal countries who have jumped on this gravy train of trying to persecute Israel.
Well, I won't try and answer for the US, but certainly from the UK, I think it's perfectly apparent that this all comes down to politics. And the fact that the current Labour government was outflanked by a number of independent candidates running on a single issue, which was Gaza. That is why, inevitably, We've seen the refunding of UNRWA, despite its complicity in the 7th of October. That is why we saw the complete U-turn that Professor Dershowitz referenced with respect to the ICC. This is a court that does not have jurisdiction over Israel. Not only are there problems with the Rome Statute, and I'm afraid the way that it was drafted to seek to criminalize inter alia the presence of Jews in Judea and Samaria. I think that's a key reason neither the US nor Israel joined it. But critically, this is a court that can only have jurisdiction through those that sign up to the Rome Statute. And the reason I believe that the UK was desirous of making a submission, raising its concerns, is because every law-abiding state should be very concerned if an international court that is governed by a statute starts to act out with its proper jurisdiction. It's no longer an international court, it's a political body that starts to pose a serious danger. And then the last example we've seen of politics playing a significant role here is this unlawful decision to embargo 30 arms licenses to prevent the UK providing those arms, UK suppliers, to Israel. This was ostensibly made on the basis of concerns that the UK government had with respect to detention and with respect to aid, both as matters of public record, the statistics that COGAT puts out, and also the fact that the International Committee of the Red Cross does not have a basis for access to those detained who are not lawful combatants. Well, those matters aside, the key issue here is that the UK hasn't raised any concern about Israel's targeting or proportionality analysis, about the use of the very arms that it has proposed to embargo. So given the unlawfulness of that decision, given the inexplicable U-turn that we've seen, I think the only answer, at least as far as the UK is concerned, is that there is a significant contingent of the population that has been utterly misled by the media coverage, in particular over the last 12 months. And they have weaponized concern over the Palestinians. I think if anyone was truly concerned over ordinary Palestinians in Gaza, the first thing that they should be calling for is for Egypt to comply with its international law obligation and provide safe passage to every Palestinian civilian fleeing civil disorder in the Gaza Strip. That is its obligation under the African Union Convention on Refugees, which it acceded to in 1980. I haven't heard that from a single individual, apart from Colonel Kemp, who's sitting right next to me. I call out this faux concern that we've heard from the British government, because if they're not willing to call on Egypt to facilitate a humanitarian zone the other side of the border with Rafah, where Palestinians can be provided for with humanitarian aid that's not diverted to Hamas, where there can be a humanitarian zone that Hamas does not fire out of, as they are doing with al-Marasi, onto Israeli civilians, then the only explanation I can possibly provide is that this is politically motivated hatred to the only Jewish state.
But it's politically motivated pressure from the electorate.
We're going to need a really brief answer because
Really
I'm going to get
brief.
one more
Brief.
question
It's
for the
politically
audience.
motivated from the electorate, and there's a reason for that. 3 of us on this panel have pulled our triggers in anger in a war zone. We understand what war looks like. We understand the effects of war. We understand how horrifying it is when an airstrike comes in and you can feel it in the core of your bones when they vibrate from the impact of a large bomb landing. Almost nobody behind you in the city that I can see, I'm looking at apartment blocks in New York right now. Almost nobody in those apartment blocks has seen war firsthand. That means that you see the impact of war and you are horrified by it. Of course you are. You'd be unhuman if you didn't. And that makes you think, if you don't know what's happening and you don't understand the context and the legality behind it, you're going to have that reaction and you're going to protest against the fact you're seeing war, especially when it's underpinned by a very, very effective information campaign, such as the one run by Hamas and their allies in Iran, Qatar, and various other countries.
One quick point. New Zealand, the most hypocritical country in the history of the universe. New Zealand joins with condemnation of Israel, doesn't even abstain. It joins and it calls Israel a colonial settler state. If you had a dictionary that had colonial settler state, the first state to come up would be New Zealand. New Zealand was settled by Englishmen who never had a single connection to the land. They got rid of the Maoris. They had a treaty and all of that. But the hypocrisy of New Zealand in voting against Israel, the hypocrisy of Ukraine abstaining, the hypocrisy of Canada abstaining. You cannot understand this without understanding that Israel is the Jew among the nations and is subject to international double standard anti-Semitism and hypocrisy.
So,
So Professor
Maybe that's the next. Maybe that's the next and final question. Yeah. Yeah. I think
I'll just add two
yeah.
on your question: ignorance and laziness. I've argued against in these halls and in Vienna against something called explosive weapons in populated areas, which translated into withholding 2,000-pound bombs from Israel, because how could they ever be used in a densely populated area? Because that initiative meant banning all bombs, missiles, mortars, anything that falls from the sky in urban combat. That initiative, I argued historically, would drive all combat into urban areas. It would create more Hamases. What do you mean? I can dig a tunnel under a building and you don't have munitions that could reach me because a 2,000-pound bomb goes 16 meters underground? Not very far. That's ignorance to where that initiative came from and got translated into political talk. And the other one is laziness. Like I've told some governments, do your homework, go there and see it yourself.
In closing, any final brief comment from you, Colonel?
Yeah, I'll try and be brief. I know this is not the briefest of panels, but I just want to say two things, really. One is this is an extremely important event because this sort of discussion, this sort of conversation does not happen in the United Nations. And I think I'd like to congratulate Yulia and the others involved in making sure this event happens.
Thank you, Yulia.
And also thank you to all of you for coming and being part of what I think is an important event. The second thing I want to say, or the final thing I want to say, is that we've heard a lot of gloomy talk about the UN, about the war, about the way that the international community regards Israel and treats Israel. But I would just say a couple of things. One is that the recent polling I've seen suggests that 80%, around 80, maybe 70, 80% of Americans support Israel. The loud and noisy minority are the ones who oppose Israel. And the same applies pretty much, I think, in the UK. And I think Israel's got a very, very bright future. I'm very optimistic about the outcome of this war once Hamas have been dealt with and annihilated in Gaza, and Hezbollah have been dealt with in Lebanon. I believe Israel is going to emerge from this war much stronger than it went into it. And there's three reasons I say that. One is because generations of Israelis have been fighting on the front line for their families, their friends, their country for a year. And that it's a terrible thing to have to do. No one would wish that on them, but it does bring strength to a country. And I think Israel will have an even deeper strength than it went into it. Secondly, Israel knows that it's got to be more self-sufficient. It's learned over the last year who it can trust, who it can't trust, who it can rely on, who it can't, and needs to be much more self-sufficient in arms manufacture and munitions, and is working on that now. And the third thing I believe is that the Jewish diaspora, I'm speaking here as a goy, but the Jewish diaspora, and by the way, a very talented Shabbat goy if anyone needs my services. But the Jewish diaspora, I think, certainly a large element of it in the US and the UK and other countries, has finally woken up to the reality of the way that Israel is viewed, particularly by international organizations. And I think there's going to be a greater tendency in the future for the diaspora to stand up and support Israel now that it realizes how much it needs them. And the final thing, and this is about the third final thing. The final thing is, I think all of us here in this room, whether we're Jews, not Jews, Israelis, not Israelis, we can be intensely proud of the extraordinary fight that the Israeli Defense Forces put up. I've seen them in action. I've seen them fighting. They're very, very brave young men and old men and women, and they've done phenomenal work beyond, I think, what any other army could possibly have achieved. Thank you.
I have to disagree with just one point. I never disagree with Colonel Kemp. Israel cannot rely on Jews in America and diaspora. Jews in America care more about their own convenience, their own success, and their own acceptance than they do about Israel. I want to underline, Israel has to go to this alone. And the one rule for Israel, never, ever compromise your security because of what anyone else tells you to do. The UN, the International Court, the Pope, academia. Israel must be its own judge, make its own judgments about security, and never count on anybody but Israel and Israel's defense industry and Israel's ability to fight for its own
Thank you,
survival.
Professor Dershowitz. And thank you to all the esteemed panelists. You're all tremendous advocates, including on the issue of proportionality. And we need to amplify your messages, and we have to amplify all of you in the information war that we're fighting at the same time. So I wanted to also thank you all for coming. Hopefully it was elucidating for all of you, and wishing you all a great night.